Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping right in today to cover a really major global event.
Absolutely.
The recent U.S. escalation involving Iran. We're talking about Operation Midnight Hammer. Those strikes targeting Iran's nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan.
Yeah, big news.
So our goal here is to give you the essential breakdown, the strategy behind it, what the U.S. hopes to gain, the immediate fallout in the region for business, and, of course, the huge implications for global energy. Think of this as your fast track to understanding what just happened and really why it matters so much.
Exactly. We'll try to connect the dots for you. There's a lot of noise out there, but we want to focus on the what, the why, and crucially, what this means for, well, everyone going forward.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Why now? What was the immediate threat that pushed the U.S. to act so decisively?
Sources are pointing to Iran getting dangerously close to weapons-grade uranium.
That's right. Specifically hitting 83.7% enrichment. And critically, this was detected at the Fordo facility.
Fordo. Right. And Fordo's the key here. Look, Israel had already hit other Iranian sites back in June, weakened them maybe. But Fordo, it's buried deep, really deep, hardened bunkers. It was just beyond what Israel could realistically target effectively.
So Israel couldn't reach it.
Pretty much. And that's where the U.S. capability becomes, well, essential. Only the United States has the B-2 stealth bombers equipped with the GBU-57 MOP.
The massive ordnance penetrator, the bunker buster.
Exactly. That's the tool you need to credibly threaten, or in this case neutralize, a target buried that deep under rock and concrete.
It's a very specific tool for a very specific problem. And, looking back, it seems to fit into a pattern. We saw this U.S. military buildup in the region, didn't we?
We did. More B-2s spotted, refuelers in the air, carrier strike groups moving into position, activity at forward operating bases.
Yeah, it all felt like more than just deterrence. It suggested maybe a shift towards having a real offensive option ready to go.
A sort of prepositioning, yeah.
Yeah.
Setting the stage.
So that sets the stage. But the actual execution, Operation Midnight Hammer itself, that sounds like it was pretty complex. How did they actually, pull it off?
Well, from what we understand, it was a sophisticated operation. They used a mix of deception, decoys probably, to confuse Iranian air defenses.
Keep them guessing.
Right. Then you had the B-2s, obviously key for penetrating airspace and delivering those heavy bunker busters onto Fordo. And complementing that, Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from submarines and surface ships, hitting Natanz and Isfahan, spreading the target.
And the scale. We're hearing numbers like 14 bunker busters, plus dozens of Tomahawks.
That's the figure circulating, yes. 14 MOPs just for Fordo, which, remember, is under something like 200 feet of rock. And then the Tomahawks for the other sites, Natanz and Isfahan. The damage seems to have been significant across the board.
Iran has officially confirmed severe damage, right? Though they also made a point of saying no radiation leak so far.
Yes, that was their official line. Acknowledging the hits, but trying to manage the perception, perhaps control the narrative about containment.
Okay, so the strikes happened. Damage confirmed. What are the immediate wins for the U.S. here? What did Midnight Hammer actually achieve in the short term?
Well, the big one is clearly the nuclear delay. This has definitely disrupted Iran's enrichment capabilities. Destroying those centrifuges, especially the advanced ones in those hardened or buried facilities like Fordo, that's a major setback for them. We're talking possibly years.
Years of delay.
Potentially, yes. And it forces Iran to rethink their whole approach, their timeline. It fundamentally alters their immediate path forward on the nuclear front.
And beyond just the physical damage, this sends a message, doesn't it, geopolitically?
Oh, absolutely. It's a major signal. It reasserts U.S. power projection, shows a willingness to act unilaterally on perceived red lines. It reassures allies, particularly Israel, about American security commitment.
Right, we've got your back message.
Exactly. And it serves as a, let's say, stark warning to other potential proliferators globally, a demonstration of capability and will.
And we probably shouldn't ignore the domestic angle in the U.S. For President Trump, this looks decisive. It fits that strong stance, that sort of pro-regime change rhetoric we've heard before. Likely plays well with his supporters.
Certainly, there's a domestic political calculation in almost any major foreign policy move. This one aligns with that image of decisive leadership.
Okay, looking a bit further out then, beyond the immediate delay.
Right, the longer-term picture. That nuclear delay, as we said, it could be substantial. Rebuilding those underground facilities, replacing specialized equipment, it's not quick. Some estimates are putting Iran's program back 10 years, maybe even more.
10 years, wow. That's significant breathing room.
It is.
And does this create leverage diplomatically?
That's the hope, I suppose, from the U.S. perspective. Suddenly, the dynamic shifts. Maybe now there's an opening for talks, perhaps mediated by someone like Putin, maybe through the UN. But the U.S. would be negotiating from a position of, well, demonstrated strength. They can set preconditions.
Like, you need to prove you're serious about rolling back before we even talk.
Something like that, yeah. It puts the onus on Iran to make the first move towards de-escalation or diplomacy. And thinking regionally, this definitely boosts the U.S. image as the main security provider in the Gulf. Could strengthen those defense ties with partners like Saudi Arabia, UAE.
Okay, but it can all be upside. Big moves like this always come with big risks. What's the potential blowback? What could Iran realistically do in retaliation?
And that's the crucial question, isn't it? Iran has options. They could use missiles or drones against U.S. bases in the region, or target shipping. That's always a threat.
The Strait of Hormuz.
We'll get to that. But also, think asymmetric. Cyber attacks are a real possibility, supporting proxy groups for attacks, even potentially activating terror cells further afield. They have a long reach through proxies.
And what about wider escalation? Other countries getting involved?
Well, Russia and China have already condemned the strikes. That's expected. The risk is, if this drags in regional proxies more directly, Hezbollah, militias in Iraq or Syria, that could easily spiral into a much wider conflict, something nobody presumably wants.
And the risk isn't just over there, right? What about impacts back home in the U.S.?
Absolutely. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, they've already put out warnings about increased domestic risk. That could mean threats to infrastructure, potential lone wolf attacks inspired by events, cyber attacks hitting U.S. networks, even protests and civil unrest. It definitely raises the domestic threat level.
Yeah, you can see why DHS would be on high alert.
And think bigger picture, too. What does this do to the whole idea of non-proliferation? If Iran feels cornered, maybe they just double down, go fully covert with their program, make it even harder to track. And does this maybe push other countries in the region to think, hey, maybe we need nuclear weapons too? It could undermine the whole global regime.
That's a really sobering thought. Okay, let's zoom in on that point you mentioned earlier, the Strait of Hormuz. It's hard to overstate how critical that waterway is.
It really is. About 20% of the entire world's oil supply flows through that narrow channel. It's a classic choke point.
And Iran knows this. They've threatened it before, haven't they? Disrupted shipping.
They have the capability, and they've shown willingness to interfere with shipping in the past, using mines, fast boats, drones. Remember, past incidents, even relatively minor ones, have spiked Brent crude oil prices sometimes way up over $100, even towards $130 a barrel.
And even a short disruption now, given the current global economic climate.
Yeah.
The impact would be massive, wouldn't it? Higher energy costs feeding straight into inflation.
Instantly. You'd feel it at the pump. Businesses would feel it. It would ripple through the global economy very, very quickly. Could easily tip fragile economies into recession.
So what's the counterplay? How do the U.S. and its allies try to keep Hormuz open if things get tense?
You'd see a major naval presence, lots of patrols, possibly escorting tankers through the strait, increased surveillance, more sanctions pressure on Iran, definitely, and just maintaining a very high level of military readiness to respond to any attempt to close it.
But the ripple effects if they can't keep it fully open.
Global fuel insecurity, number one. Economic slowdowns, absolutely. And huge pressure on countries really dependent on that oil, like India and China. It becomes a global economic crisis, not just a regional security one.
Okay, brings us to the future. What are the possible paths forward from here? Let's start with the best case scenario for the U.S. What does that look like?
Well, the optimistic view. Iran, under this new pressure, feels compelled to de-escalate. Maybe they offer a verifiable freeze on enrichment or even roll some of it back. That could reopen diplomatic channels, lead to negotiations, maybe even a revised deal. The U.S. could claim a political win, having forced Iran back to the table on more favorable terms.
Okay, that's the best case. What about the most likely scenario, realistically?
More likely, probably, is a sort of simmering conflict. Iran retaliates, but maybe indirectly, through its proxies, to avoid direct confrontation. They'd likely boost their air defenses, harden remaining sites, and almost certainly continue enrichment efforts, just maybe more covertly. It becomes a tense standoff, a cat-and-mouse game, not necessarily immediate talks.
Right, a prolonged period of tension. And the worst case. What keeps strategists up at night?
The nightmare scenario is miscalculation. One side misinterprets the other's actions, a retaliatory strike goes too far, and it spirals into direct U.S.-Iran conflict. Or a wider regional war erupts, pulling in neighbors and proxies. And then the biggest fear, perhaps, is that powers like Russia or China get involved more directly, maybe economically backing Iran, maybe militarily. That leads to, truly global instability, massive economic disruption, geopolitical alignments shifting, very dangerous territory.
So wrapping this up, it sounds like Operation Midnight Hammer was a really high-stakes move by the U.S.
Absolutely. A gamble.
Get that short-term win, potentially the nuclear delay, a boost to deterrence maybe, but the risks are enormous. Wider war, the economic shock if Hormuz gets hit, damage to international efforts like non-proliferation.
Exactly. And the linchpin, the thing that could affect everyone most directly and immediately, is still the Strait of Hormuz. Global oil prices, supply chains, security, so much hinges on keeping that passage open and stable. That remains the flashpoint to watch.
So as you're thinking about all this, maybe consider this question. How could this single operation, this moment of decisive action, end up reshaping not just the Middle East, but the entire global balance of power for years, maybe even decades to come? Something to definitely keep an eye on.